So Mussolini, who was Mussolini? So Mussolini was actually initially a socialist, right? He even was an editor for a newspaper, but he was also a strong nationalist. He participated in World War I, but he didn't really do much there, even though he would flaunt that experience significantly. He wasn't really much of a war hero. He mostly just sat around behind the front lines. And anyway, his experience in World War I completely transformed his views away from socialism and towards what would become fascism. So Mussolini, right? One of my favorite things about him is that he would build that he'd have all these giant M's built all over Italy for some reason, which I find very amusing. And as you can see on the left, we have a picture of Mussolini skiing around Italy without a shirt. And that is because Mussolini had a very different image of himself than Hitler. Because if you're a dictator, there are basically two images that you can create of yourself as a man. First of all, you had what Stalin was doing alongside Hitler, where it's like, the backler of the nation, didn't have time for women, working every day for 18 hours to keep the homeland, the fatherland, the motherland safe and prosperous, working for all the German people, or the Soviet people, whatever. And then you had the other approach. Mussolini followed this kind of macho man approach, basically what Putin is doing in the modern day. So he'd have a lot of these photos of himself going hunting, skiing, swimming, himself without a shirt. It was well known that he had many affairs, that he slept with many women, and so he went in the other direction. And so yeah, that's a cool fact, although more leaning into his domestic policy. But what were the factors that allowed Mussolini to take over? First of all, we had what was called Transformismo. Italian politics were very divided. The political parties were constantly shifting, but very little was actually ever done. And there was little progress that could be seen by the average Italian. Second of all, the economic situation was poor after World War I, and there was significant anger with the results of World War I, and then with the government as an extension of that. And not, first of all, among the people and also among the veterans. After all, Italy lost 1 million men fighting after Hungary, and what were the results? They're nothing, basically. They got some of the land they wanted, but not all of it. They felt betrayed, and the entirety of Italian society was pretty angry. Then we have the Red Threat. So, just like in Germany, the communists are seen as a significant threat to the current society and its current order. Then we have the church. The church was a big fan of Mussolini and Mussolini fascists because they saw them as a bulwark of conservatism and a bulwark against communism. So the church leaders, they turned people towards the fascist party and worked with the fascist party and Mussolini. Then we have the Italian royal family. While this was not the case for the king of Italy, Emmanuel the something, I don't remember what number. For example, the brother of the Italian king was a big fan of fascism and Mussolini, and there were supporters in the Italian royal family, so there was this pro-fascist influence even within the constitutional monarchy of Italy. And then there was also the fact that the Italian government simply failed to do anything about Mussolini's march on Rome, because when Mussolini marched on Rome, the Italian black shirts and the Italian fascists were completely unprepared. They weren't really able to do anything. So, it was raining. They arrived at different hours in mismatched trains without proper equipment. But this was all very public. This was all announced publicly and well known. So the authorities were ready. The army was out on the streets, sandbags set up, machine guns set up, but the order to fire never came, even though the Italian government could have very easily stopped the fascist takeover. And the result is that Mussolini takes over. But when we consider Mussolini's dictatorship, we have to think about a few things. First of all, we have some similarities with Hitler. He had that same degree of pragmatism about him. As a matter of fact, especially after 1929, where the Great Depression hit Europe, he was very respected by Western elites and the Western publics because, Italy wasn't hit very hard by the Great Depression. So they saw him as, a good, reasonable leader. Maybe he wasn't democratic, but he was a great statesman. That was the view. And second of all, everybody wanted to work with Mussolini. They wanted to be his friends. The French and the British were trying to cooperate with Mussolini so that Italy would serve as a bulwark against Germany. And at the beginning, they were this was pretty effective because Mussolini initially had a very bad view of Hitler. And we can also see how in 1934, when Hitler first tried to carry out a coup in Austria, how the Italians mobilized troops and moved them to the Austrian border in response. But on the other hand, there was a lot of detriments because unlike Hitler, Mussolini had very weak control over the Italian people and the regime itself. He wasn't a personality who could work without the party. Actually, when he took over, he kept democratic officials in top posts because he was worried that party leadership could undermine his authority, because the Council of Fascists was very influential. And then there was also other organizations, like the church, for example, because the church was such an important pillar of Mussolini's popularity, of Mussolini's regime. He couldn't really go against the church. And then there was this other thing that relatively he didn't have as much of a strong control over the people. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, the people of Italy were very in support of what Mussolini was doing. But when he started, to get kind of out of hand and try to carry out stuff like the reform of customs, where he told people not to shake hands when they meet someone, but give them this Roman salute, the people thought that was stupid, and he didn't do it. Basically, nobody cared. They just made fun of it. When he tried to introduce race laws, which would ban marriage between Jews and Italians, Mussolini was an anti-Semite. He was doing this mostly to appease Hitler, or at least he wasn't a big anti-Semite, let's say. The people pretty much ignored it. And as soon as that happened, support evaporated, and we'd see that, the people were willing, and that, we'd have the overthrow of Mussolini when the Allies land in Italy. Yes, Mishta, I'll return. I'll upload the recording later. I'll try to edit it so that to get rid of those people who are interrupting and stuff. So yeah. Anyway, then we also have to consider that there was relatively. All right, one more thing, right? The North and South divide. There was a big division between the North and the South in Italy. The North, right? Those were the small states initially before unification. So we had, the state of Piedmont. We had city-states like Venice or what's it called? The other trading one. Well, whatever, doesn't matter. And those were this was an industrial part of the country. They were very rich, very industrialized, a lot of successes. Although, unfortunately, they were pretty much at the level of Western Europe. But the South, it was completely different. The further south in Italy you'd go, the stronger the mafia got and the poorer the people got. These were the formal territories of the church. And while Mussolini was successful in suppressing the mafia, he never actually eliminated it. The mafia just kind of went underground and reappeared as soon as the Allies landed. As a matter of fact, the Italian mafia cooperated closely with the US and the British during World War II, especially in Sicily, which was their stronghold. So we basically see that, there was a lot going for him internationally, but, he also never had that degree of control that other major actors had. And we could see basically that Mussolini's regime was brutal but not bloodthirsty. That's a good quote to memorize. Basically, Mussolini's regime was also brutal, but it wasn't, trying to seek out blood for the sake of blood.
Wait, could you explain that point one more time?
Brutal but not bloodthirsty? Okay.
Yeah.
So, Mussolini was a brutal dictator, right? There's no doubt about it. The Italian fascists, they carried out some assassinations. They were willing to go in and, bash people over the head with a brick. They were willing to use force to go in and invade, Abyssinia, to fight in the Spanish Civil War, to bombard Corfu, to intimidate the Albanians. But at the same time, there was never this apparatus or scale of like Stalin. They weren't carrying out mass executions. They weren't kidnapping people off the streets in massive numbers. There was never this deep surveillance state in Italy. Yes, there was the Italian secret police that existed, but it never reached the level of brutality and depravity that we find under Stalin or Mao or Hitler, for example. That's the point. And yeah, also.
So, in your opinion, you would say Mussolini is much nicer compared to Hitler and all those other people?
Yes, that's definitely something that can be brought up. Of course, we cannot say that he was a kind human being or that he wasn't brutal, but very definitely he was not nearly as brutal as pretty much any other dictator that you'd be studying under IB. That's something that's key to remembering. And on the left, before we go into some key foreign policy dates, on the top left you see that's the headquarters of the Italian Fascist Party, with a face of Mussolini and a bunch of CCCs. And in the bottom left, that's actually the U.S. Army in Rome in 1944, meeting with one of the Vatican guards after the United States kicked Mussolini out of Italy, alongside the British and some other less important Allied powers. Now,
Wait, I had a question.
Yeah.
I was wondering if the CCC had any connotation or meaning to it.
You know what? I don't speak Italian, but I'm pretty sure it means yes, yes, yes.
Oh, okay.
So I think it's just supposed to symbolize approval for Mussolini and the Fascist Party. How everybody is for Mussolini. Everybody says yes to Mussolini, the fascists, and their way. I believe that's what they're trying to go for. But I don't speak Italian, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. Anyway, what were at least.
Could you go over how Mussolini got overthrown?
Yeah, sure. So basically, as I said, right, Mussolini's popularity was fading over time as he became more extreme, and also due to the poor progress of World War II. So the final result was that eventually the Italian people got fed up with him, and as we all know, Italy switched sides when the Allies landed. The elites turned on Mussolini. He was rescued by Hitler in a very daring commando raid on the hotel where he was being held, and then he basically was given northern Italy beyond that, the Alps to govern. But eventually, the Italian partisans got to him, and they hung him upside down and bashed his face in. And if you want to look for gruesome photos of an effed up Mussolini being hung upside down, those are very easy to find, should that interest you for some reason. So, but anyway, let's go back to the key foreign policy issues, right? So what was Mussolini trying to achieve on the world stage? He wanted to make Italy great again, that's important to consider, in a number of respects, right? So he wanted to restore Italian power, restore this image of the Roman Empire, so expand colonies into Africa, and he was trying to move into Albania, the Balkans, and Greece, right? That's important to consider, this imperial focus. But also, for an example, by making Italy respected on the world stage, by bringing up the standard of living and economics in Italy, by building a strong Italian society. And he was also trying to, in a shorter term, get that land that Italy felt it was cheated out of after World War I and the Versailles treaties. That land which should belong to Italy, like the city of Fiume, which Italy managed to get with this semi-covert action similar to what kind of basically also a rebellion linked to the government unofficially, which and later Fiume would be incorporated into Italy. So
wait, I had a question.
Yeah.
With the Italian economy, do you think they were in more a inflation or a deflation or a stagflation at the time?
Well, that depends on the period, because initially we actually had deflation because there was this battle for the lira, as Mussolini called it. He tried to really raise the value of Italian currency, which basically, he succeeded in doing so, but this resulted in basically major price rises for a number of goods, and it was also harder to export Italian goods abroad, which actually had a negative effect on the Italian economy. But, all of this was undone during the Great Depression, where the lira basically also was inflated significantly again. But actually, these Mussolini's policies made it so that the Great Depression had a very small impact on Italy. And the result was that, that Italy was actually seen as a model, and Mussolini was seen as a model by many in the West who were much more significantly impacted by, by the Great Depression. But anyway, Mussolini's foreign policy, right? So 1922, March on Rome. Then we had the Corfu incident, which we just discussed earlier, and Italy gains Fiume in 1924, and then 1926, Albania becomes a protectorate. Mussolini is making all these achievements by exerting power locally. And in 1925, the Locarno Agreement is signed with Italy as a key partner. And and in 1931, Italy intervenes in Libya, which is under Italian control, due to some rebellions, in order to, it's a punitive campaign which brings it more strictly under Italy's control. And in 1934, of course, we have Mussolini's response to Hitler's coup attempt in Austria. And we have to remember that Mussolini is working together with the French and the British, and at this stage he sees them as better partners than Hitler and Hitler's Germany, which he doesn't trust. But everything will change after the Abyssinian Crisis of 1935-36, when Mussolini invades Abyssinia. Abyssinia was one of the 4 countries in Africa which, by that stage, did not fit into the typical mold of being colonized by the Europeans. There were 4 exceptions. There were the Egyptians, which were officially independent, but they had their own monarchy, but they were basically a puppet of the British. We had South Africa, which was basically also part of the British Empire, but it was basically independent for domestic matters. It had the same status as a dominion, just like Australia and Canada. Then we had Liberia. Liberia was colonized by black Americans, often former slaves, but also intellectuals from the North in general, who believed that that the best thing to do is for African Americans to return to Africa. But the result was that they treated the local African people no better than white colonizers, because they also considered themselves to be superior. So a lot of people say that the country wasn't colonized because it was blacks, but the truth was it was also colonized. The African Americans treated the local Africans just as bad as as the whites. Of course, this is more complicated because different European countries were very different in terms of the level of brutality and tolerance they had in their African colonies, and this is not a discussion on African history. But anyway, Ethiopia was the last country, and this was the one country which was truly independent, never conquered by the Europeans, a Catholic state, even, actually. And Italy had tried to take it over in the 19th century, but they failed. This was a big humiliation, and Mussolini wanted to, first of all, reverse this humiliation and also expand that Italian empire. And the British and the French publics were appalled. And the League of Nations responded, right? So the British and French, they came up with this scheme where they basically placed sanctions on both Italy and Abyssinia, knowing that obviously sanctions on weapons are not going to affect Italy in the war against Abyssinia, which doesn't have its own domestic arms industry. And they were hoping that, by taking this, half-hearted measure, they could still keep their alliance with Mussolini, but this pissed off Mussolini, who now moved towards Hitler. So this is a turning point. What's important to just remember from Abyssinia is that the French and the British effectively tried to, find this middle ground where they would look good for their domestic publics while maintaining the alliance with Mussolini, but they failed on both accounts. The British and the French domestic publics were not thrilled at all with the final results either. Then in 1936, the Spanish Civil War breaks out. There's a major Italian intervention. And this is largely a mistake because, the nationalists of Spain never really did much to help Italy back. But the Italian army came out weaker from the Spanish Civil War than when it entered it. And when Italian tanks would roll into France in 1940, the Italian army would be significantly weaker than it was at the start of the Spanish Civil War. And it's also important to remember that in 1937, as an extension of the Abyssinian Crisis and the criticism he received, Italy left the League of Nations. To expand a bit about Italy's military weakness, Italy was the one country among the major powers on paper, who did not have triangular divisions. So there were only it had only 2 regiments per division, not 3, which was a significant issue because in military strategy or tactics, you usually have units of 3 because you can have 2 units forward and a third one in reserve. So you can have a rotation, so some people can rest. If the enemies make a major breakthrough, you have people to fill the gap. And if you fill the gap, and if you make a breakthrough in the enemy lines, then you have a ready force which can move in and exploit it. But, the Italian army was also poorly equipped. Even with only 2 regiments, they were unable to fully equip them with ammunition and enough artillery. The Italian armor was pretty bad overall. It was fallen behind the rest of the world. And if we want to talk about the firepower of an Italian division had around 1/3 of the weight of firepower of a French division or a German division. And weight of firepower is basically the measure of how many tons of ammunition, artillery shells, bullets, etc., a unit can theoretically fire in 1 minute. So it basically just shows. Basically Italian units were very weak at the end of World War I. And we would see, of course, that Mussolini really fails to, advance into Greece, to stop the British in Egypt, largely because of poor equipment. Not that the Italians were cowards. That's not really true based on the record. They were just poorly equipped and poorly led. That's the unfortunate fact for the Italians. And morale fell over time. And of course, this weak performance of the Italian army and the mounting losses would significantly contribute to the further loss of Mussolini's popularity at home. Now, before we move on to Imperial Japan, are there any questions on Mussolini and his foreign policy?
Yeah, so his policy was based on making Italy great again.
Yeah, we can say that.
Wait, for the reason why the Italy's army had weak supplies, do you think that was based on the deflation that happened and how they were unable to import stuff?
No, probably not. I mean, it's just the fact that Italy wasn't able to. First of all, just the Italian economy in general was not strong enough to support a large armed force with a large military industry. And second of all, they basically failed to develop that industry. The Italian economy was, performing pretty well throughout the interwar period, even after the Great Depression. But as I highlighted, it wasn't super strong, right? And they weren't really able to develop an effective arms industry. All right.
Could you mute yourself?
All right.
I was asking a question, so.
Oh, you have a question? Another question?
No, but your question was not focused. It was not on topic.
You can shut up. You've been warned before, so please shut up.
All right, guys.
Bro, come on. There's discrimination right there.
Guys, come on, show. You got any more questions, or can we move on to the Japanese? Nazarina is typing something, so we'll give a wait. See if there's any questions from chat first. Yeah. Let me wait. So he just wants to take Abyssinia and make Italy a great country. Well, I mean, that's part of it, right? Abyssinia was seen, first of all, part of his ambitions to restore the Italian Empire, restore the Roman Empire, even, you could say. An extension of his... He saw it as a way that he could, gain more domestic support. He wanted to reverse Italy's great embarrassment of failing to take over Abyssinia in the 19th century. So, yes, this was largely an extension of this expansionist nationalism, trying to make Italy great. Because, I mean, honestly, there wasn't really much to gain from taking over Abyssinia. From, a strategic perspective of, resources or bases or whatever.